I'd like to thank Oliver, obviously, for inviting me to the EBSN meeting, and it also gives me the opportunity to thank him for his generosity in advising me and helping me with this book. The one thing he emphasized to me was that there was a need for a scientific approach to Burroughs' writing, and of course that was something which was music to my ears, because that's what he's kind of been to me. It also gives me the opportunity to thank other people who are here, Warwick Sweeney, who is Dr. Dent's grandson, who you will hear about during my talk, and Jim Pennington, who some of you watched during the beautiful mimeograph demonstration yesterday. Now, I'm really used to talking to huge audiences in American hotel ballrooms. I mean, I gave the American Academy of Neurology Lifetime Achievement Award in front of 3,000 people. But what I'm not used to doing is talking about myself. As many of you know, doctors are encouraged to listen and observe and not say very much about themselves. And in fact, if you talk too much about yourself, or even if you go on television, you're frowned upon by the establishment. And Oliver Sacks, who was a mentor to me and a great friend, and I suppose for many young people going into neurology, was their guru. He's really generated this idea of neurophilia, which has almost replaced philosophy in many universities. His one regret when I saw him before he died was that he'd never been really accepted by his profession, because he really saw himself as a neurologist, even though he was a rather unusual neurologist, and he had the disadvantage of being face blind, which is a major handicap if you're in medicine, that you can't recognize people's faces when you see them. So that was, although he had a world-standing reputation, he was considered to be the most well-known and famous living neurologist on the planet, and he had a global practice. He regretted that his colleagues didn't have the imagination to understand what he was trying to do. And I think the reason it's taken me so long to write my book is that I've always enjoyed being a doctor. I value the fraternity and the brotherhood of medicine. I enjoy the company of my colleagues. But I feared that if I wrote this book when I was younger, it may have counted against me. So I took the cowardly route and waited till I was almost at the stage of retirement before I decided to write it. So I need to really just tell you a little bit about myself too. Both my parents came from Oldham, and our family on both sides has a very strong link to the Greater Manchester area. My ancestors were weavers on the Pennine Ridge, and then they came into the city and worked in the mines and in the cotton mills. But my father escaped through going to Manchester University, and he was a direct contemporary of Anthony Burgess. And he graduated in English and became a schoolmaster, and I was born in St. Helens, so I'm very much a product of those little Lancashire towns, romantic Lancashire towns, where women die of love. And as a small boy, my father used to take me to the Liverpool docks, and many of my early memories relate. I suppose it was a kind of bonding between a father and son, but we used to go every weekend on the bus, the magic bus from St. Helens to Liverpool, and watch the molasses coming in from Brazil to the Tate and Lyle factory on Love Lane, the cotton bales coming in, which eventually, of course, came down to Manchester. And one day, coming off a Booth Line ship called the Hillary in the Brunswick docks, a man who I later discovered was well known in Liverpool, called Barney Lafferty, and was known as the Animal Man. He came off the ship with three beautiful macaws from Brazil. It was the Booth Line ships coming back from the Amazon. And my father got talking to him, and he told me he was selling these parrots to Chester Zoo, and he was a kind of a little side issue. So I got this early feeling of Liverpool being a very important point of departure, and that kind of stuck with me, even when we moved to Leeds at the age of 10. And this was a very difficult time for me, and my parents were very strong Lancastrians, and many of you, as we're up in the northwest, will understand this. It was, I think, much harder maybe than moving from Belfast to Dublin, or Dublin to Belfast, or Glasgow to Edinburgh, particularly as my father was an exile. I mean, he lived in exile, which those of you perhaps coming from America find this very difficult to imagine, because we're talking about two counties 30 miles apart from one another, so it's really a very small, but certainly in those days there was still great rivalry between, and it took me quite a lot of time to settle down in Leeds, and I got very interested in natural history, joined the Leeds Naturalists, and adopted an edgeland on the northern part of Leeds in Gledhow, where I recorded animals and insects and flowers. And then one day the bulldozers arrived from Leeds City Corporation, this would be the late 50s, and destroyed all this, which was my sort of little paradise really, and where I played, and where I learned many things. And this also had quite a profound effect on me, and I kind of turned inwards, and I started to frequent more and more public libraries, and I kind of built up an Amazonian paradise in my own bedroom. So my own bedroom became my paradise, and one of the books that I read in my teens, before I did my higher educational exams, was this pretty huge tome for a teenager. It's a 2-volume tome, notes of a botanist on the Amazon and Andes. It was compiled posthumously by Wallace, who, as you know, was involved in the theories of creation with Darwin, and who was a friend of Richard Spruce's in the Amazon when they were both there together with Henry Bates. So I started to read all the books about the Amazon, the British Victorian explorers at the Amazon. And these were the first real professional botanists who were actually making a living out of collecting plants for their sponsors. So they were not rich people who were going on ships like Darwin. They were actually people whose living it was to go into the Amazon, catalogue plants, and then that's how they made a living. But really what they were trying to search for was the origin of life, and to encourage nature to unveil its secrets. And the innocence of these early scientists taught me a great deal, which, although of course botany is irrelevant to the practice of medicine now, there are no faculties of botany even at universities now, which is in my view a great shame. The methods that I've learned through my interest in natural history, the need for thoroughness, the meticulous attention to detail, the importance of recording one's findings, and also to putting the right name on things, was inestimably helpful later on in my career. And by the time I'd done my A-levels, I wanted to follow Spruce and Wallace and Bates into the Amazon and maybe become the next David Attenborough. But my parents very wisely directed me towards medicine because they thought it was a safer option, less risky. And at the time I wasn't particularly happy about it, but now I thank them very much really for doing that, because I've really enjoyed my medical career. And I went down to, I'll just, maybe we'll just talk about Doc Schindler now from the Jan.G.H letters. This is Richard Evans Schultz, who, like me, fell in love with Richard Spruce. He freely admitted that Richard Spruce was one of his mentors and his admirers. But instead of continuing with medicine, Schultes also started in medicine at Harvard. But he was very impressed by Oakes Ames, one of the botanists who were at Harvard at that time, and switched to botany as his speciality. And as those of you who've read the Jan.G.H letters will know, and I'll tell you a little bit later about, he was quite an influence for a short period of time on Burroughs, particularly while they were in the rainforest. Schultes came every year to Yorkshire, where Spruce was born, near the Castle Howard estate, and here he is with Spruce's graveyard in Terrington. And the other thing I learned from Spruce, reading Spruce, or at least I think I learned, and also Schultes describes here, is this.
Many of our common medicines were first discovered from plants, later synthesized to make them more available. But in the Amazon, for example, there are 80,000 species of plants. To give you some measuring rod, New England has 1,900 only. 80,000 species. If chemists are going to try to get material of 80,000 species and analyze them and then give them to pharmacologists, this job will never be done, never be finished. What we should do is concentrate on those plants that people in these societies have found have some effect on the human body.
Now, unfortunately, Big Pharma hasn't taken much notice of that. They all pay lip service to phytochemicals, and indeed, many of the recent anti-cancer drugs stem from the marine and natural world. But the amount of investment the pharmaceutical company are putting into the sort of work that Schultes has recommended, which is ethnobotanical research, is really quite minimal. They'd rather spin the molecular roulette wheel. So I went down to London for interview. In those days, provided you didn't flunk your A-levels, you'd get in if they liked you on the interview. So the interview was pretty important, perhaps more important than it is these days. And I had a number of interviews at different hospitals, but the one I wanted to go to, and the one that I fortunately got into, was the London Hospital, which you can see here. It's about to be knocked down on the Whitechapel Road. And my mother had done quite a bit of research about the different hospitals, so I spouted all this out at the interview. But they asked me why I'd chosen the London, and I don't know, I still wondered what was telling me to say that these days. I told them that because it was close to the docks. The docks were still working in London in the early 60s. The West India docks, East India docks were still there. And I also said because it specialised in diseases of the poor. At that time it was the home of the Cockneys, and the Cray twins were there, and this sort of thing. So I got in, much to my surprise, and in a way much to my worry, because I was a bit frightened about going down to London. It was quite a big trip in those days, and I got started on my medical career. And I got on fine at first. I kind of shut myself away quite a lot and studied, and I was missing St. Helens and the Northwest a lot, and I kind of hid myself away. But as I started on my clinical studies, I started to get into the hang of things. It took me a long time to come to terms with the suffering that was all around me, but I was impressed by the goodness that I saw and the kindness and the humanity, particularly amongst many of the senior nurses and some of the doctors. It was the swinging 60s in London, and that even permeated to the medical schools, although of course those of you of my vintage, and it's probably still true today, know that medical students are in a way separated from the active life of a university. They're kind of, we serve an apprenticeship, and it takes us away from that exciting cross-fertilization that most university students have. But anyway, even in the medical schools, it had got through. And just to give you an idea of how things have changed so much, I mean, when our group was 80 students, 70 of them were males, 7 were women, and there were no black students at all. So that was the kind of mix. And there was a mix of grammar school boys and public school boys. A lot of them, their fathers were doctors. And one of the people in my year shot himself on the first day of medical school. So I think the trauma of dissecting and so on was quite traumatic. Anyway, it was in 67 that I first came across Burroughs. I was a keen Beatles fan, like many people perhaps in this audience. Bought Sgt. Pepper's album in 1967, and I suppose this was a kind of influence of Spruce, really, that and I don't know how many of you would have bothered to do this, but I kind of went through all those people on that cover and tried to find out who they all were, and there were lists of how they were. Of course, I recognized less than half of them. I mean, I didn't know who most of them were, so it wasn't that Burroughs was the only one I'd never heard of, although he did seem to have come out of nowhere, as far as I could see. And I just learned that he was a writer, and that was it, and I didn't think anything more about it. And then as my clinical career went on, I was still aware very much of the inspirational nature and the kindness of many of my teachers. I was still interested in trying to solve disease and cure and help disease, and the nurses were always an inspiration, but I began to get disillusioned, and I'm not sure quite what was behind that, but it was in the end of 1968 when I read, somebody recommended me to read Naked Lunch, and I found it difficult. I didn't really understand it. I found it pornographic. I found it obscene. I found it, I don't know, I mean, I couldn't quite make it out or really understand it. But there were certain things in it which, and particularly the character of Doc Benway, which kind of stuck with me. And although it seems ridiculous to probably a few today, where doctors these days are much more empathetic and humane than they were at that time, I related in some ways Doc Benway's character to one particular of my teachers. And I'll just read you a little bit from the book. Benway's unsettling bedside manner reminded me of my surgical teacher, C.T., with his penchant for drastic and fearless intervention. His punitive ward rounds, where terrified juniors and a simpering nursing sister would lead him on a sightseeing tour of his condemned lung cancer victims, were an abomination. Many of his operated patients were in severe pain, but nevertheless were expected to sit bolt upright in bed as the great man strode by. He rarely spoke directly to his patients. In theatre, he threw scalpels and humiliated his assistants. His power was absolute, and his decision-making infallible. He gave the impression that he had a visceral contempt for the frailty of the human organism. And you know, I almost dropped out of medical school, really, because something got to me, whether it was Benway or this was just a sort of token of what was happening at the time. It's difficult to be sure now, looking back. But I came eventually to what I now see as a sort of Faustian bargain with Burroughs, so that Burroughs said to me, you can finish your medical studies and become a doctor, if you continue to listen to me throughout your career. And that's what I've done, and I want to tell you a bit about that. And it's only recently I've come to see this as a sort of inverse symmetry with Burroughs, because many of you here, of course, know that he started life, well, he often said in interviews that if he hadn't become a writer, he would have liked to have been a doctor. And he did enter medical studies at the University of Vienna. He dropped out very quickly. And he had aspirations to become a psychiatrist at that time. And in many ways, my reading of his work is that he always in some ways saw himself as a doctor, but perhaps a doctor just for a selected number of people, perhaps his friends. I mean, he would never have wanted to treat all sorts of different people. When I went to James Grauholt, who very kindly wrote the foreword for the book, he said many of William's friends, close friends, breathed a sigh of relief when he decided to drop out of medical school, because he would most certainly have killed hundreds of people. But I seem to have come, I've ended up perhaps a little where Burroughs started, and maybe the other way around, I don't know, but anyway, so this is a clip which, when I show this clip to doctors, of course I get chuckles of laughter, maybe I'll get them here, but I suspect many of you will be familiar with this, and some people, some experts have been interested to know what Oliver and others in the audience think, say that Burroughs kind of empathized very much with Benway. He sort of saw himself as a kind of Benway. So this is him playing...
nurse.
Playing Benway.
I can't find his pulse, Doctor.
Dr. Benway. Cardiac arrest, goddammit.
Adrenaline, Doctor?
No, the night porter shut it off for kicks. Picks up one of those vacuum cups, the end of a stick they use to unstop toilets. He advances on the patient. Make an incision, Dr. Limp. I'm gonna massage the heart. Dr. Limp shrugs and begins the incision. Dr. Benway washes the suction cup by swishing it around the toilet bowl.
Couldn't it be sterilized, Doctor?
Very likely, but there's no time. Watching his assistant makes incision. He sits on the suction cup like a cane thief. You young squirts couldn't lance a pimple without an electric vibrating scalpel with automatic drain and suture. All the skill is going out of surgery, all the know-how and make do. Did I ever tell you about the time I performed an appendectomy with a rusty sardine can? And once I was caught short without instrument one and removed an uterine tumor with my teeth. That was in the upper effendi, and besides, the wench is dead.
The incision is ready, Doctor.
Dr. Benway forces the cup into the incision and works it up and down. Blood spurts all over the doctors, the nurses, the wall. The cup makes a horrible suction sound.
I think he's gone, Doctor.
Well, it's all a day's work.
And of course, this is what NDA...
He walks across the room to a medicine cabinet. Some druggist cut my cocaine with Sandy Flush.
And these sort of comical routines are, of course, what endear many people to...
Nurse,
Sand
the boy out to fit.
So, you know, so he got chuckles of laughter here too, so that's good. How did, I obviously can't tell you about all the intersections. As my career went on, I decided to specialize in neurology, and then particularly in the field of Parkinson's disease, because in the 60s I was fortunate enough to be one of the very first junior doctors to use what we considered at that time to be a miraculous drug called L-Dopa. And it was thought to be the panacea. It was the 60s, so there was an era of great optimism. We thought we'd have cracked all the neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, motor neuron disease, and so on within a short time. Unfortunately, it's not proved to be as simple as that. And although L-DOPA remains the best treatment we have, which is in a kind of way an indictment into medical research that we haven't managed to do any better than we did 50 years ago, it is a very remarkable drug and certainly helps many people with Parkinson's. So that was, I think, one of the inspirations for me to go into the field, particularly of Parkinson's disease work. And I started to do quite a lot of research and try to do this difficult balance of seeing patients and doing research at the same time. And I very frequently, over the years, remembered my deal with Burroughs and continued to read his books. Obviously, the Jan.G.H letters I'd read fairly early and not long after Naked Lunch, but I read more and more of his books over the decades as they've gone on. And this is really a list of some of the intersections, and I'm going to talk to you about one or two of them. Obviously, we've heard a lot already at the conference about negative aspects of control systems, which, of course, the pharmaceutical companies are a soft target, but the government are just as much to blame. The government don't sponsor virtually no innovative research into drug development. Everything hinges on commercial companies to develop new drugs and also to supply new drugs. So we've had a problem in the field of Parkinson's of very useful, efficacious drugs suddenly disappearing from the market because retailers are selling them overseas and so on. So, and then of course there's the huge problem of university bureaucracy, which many of you will empathize with, research and development departments who build up their own control systems, ethics committees that vary from one institution to the next. All of this means that it takes us 3 times as long to do a research project now than it did in the 80s. And Burroughs, of course, with his great prescience for so many things, recognized all what was going to happen and get worse. Well, one of the things which I won't talk too much about, but which has been very important to me, is self-experimentation. And of course, Burroughs, in a sense, became his own petri dish and sacrificed his brain for medical research. And you know, researching on yourself has a very noble tradition in medicine. In fact, many of the great discoveries of medicine have occurred through mavericks who have done self-experimentation, but now it's denigrated and it's considered subjective, useless. Most medical journals will refuse to publish an N=1 study, and yet to me, when I was training at University College Hospital, it seemed the most ethical possible thing to do. If you're going to give a drug to a patient, surely you should see what it does on yourself. And of course now what happens is normal volunteers are paid thousands of pounds and take risks through the pharmaceutical company. But I think if you're developing new drugs, you should try them yourself. And I tried several of the drugs which went on to be tested in people with Parkinson's and which have come onto the market. So that's really all I'll say about self-experimentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about apomorphine because it's so central to many things in Burroughs, even the claim that he made that he would never have assembled Naked Lunch without the help of apomorphine, and then talk a little bit about addiction. And I'm not going to talk anything about the dream machine, except that we're using strobe and flicker to investigate the mechanisms of visual hallucinations in people with Parkinson's disease who get a lot of formed visual hallucinations, usually people and animals, as part of the illness itself. And of course, Burroughs' interest in deep brain stimulation, Delgado's work in Yale, where you could put an implant into a bull and turn it round from the matador with a remote control thing. These are now no longer science fiction. We're using deep brain stimulation to treat people with Parkinson's disease, and it's now going back people are looking at it again for certain forms of psychiatric illness, refractory psychiatric illness. So I won't talk too much about that. I don't need to tell this audience about Burroughs coming to London to see Dr. Dent. Warwick is here, and some of these pictures are his that I'm showing. This is Addison Road, where at the bottom where Burroughs actually first met Dr. Dent, and this is Dr. Dent, for those of you who've not seen him. Now I'll just, you may...
I want to ask you, supposing a patient comes to you in an advanced state of alcoholism, what can you do for him? Well, the first thing I would have to get his confidence.
BBC recording.
The first thing I would say to him would be, I'm not a moralist. I'm not talking about free will or willpower or anything like that, because I don't know much about it. I'm a chemist. And you may or may not, and we all may or may not have any willpower at all, I don't know. But we certainly are quite positive that we are bags of chemistry. You have been damaged by alcohol, a chemical. And I cannot imagine you're being turned back into somebody who is not damaged, except by a chemical antidote.
So he was, he introduced himself as a chemist, which, as you can imagine, in the 1950s was an unusual approach when psychoanalysis was still in its prime. And Dent's main contribution, Warwick has always emphasized this to me, is that he was very much ahead of his time in the sense that he realized that apomorphine wasn't an aversive treatment. Sure, it might make people sick, but it wasn't working by making people sick, like antabuse, for example. That it had metabolic and chemical effect on the back brain.